Hey everyone, welcome to our live stream. I'm really excited for today's stream because we are live here with Tony Phillips, who was one of the original co-founders of Hack Reactor. Hack Reactor is one of the top boot camps in the country. Was there at the very beginning, and we really have been wanting this for a long time to under capture, share a little bit the history of boot camps, where they came from, and then hear from the original people who brought it there. So, really excited to have Tony with us today. And Tony, love for you. Why don't you give a quick introduction to yourself, maybe what you were doing before you founded Hack Reactor, and then
Just what happened.
What happened?
How did we get Hack Reactor?
Yeah, how did we end up here? We're here now. So I born in Michigan, moved to California for school, pre-med. Like for a lot of people, I realized that medicine was not for me, but sort of too late. I had already gone through all of pre-med before I realized that I didn't want to do that. And I went abroad. I did a Fulbright in Korea for a while and learned Korean and taught in schools there for a while. And then my brother was working at Twitter at the time. And so he would, call me and be like, hey, by the way, you should totally come back and learn to program and get a job. It's amazing. There's free snacks. Like, I remember free snacks being like one of the pinnacle things that was just like, what? How does that even? This is like when Google started being like free lunches and everyone was like, oh, it's impossible. How could you do that? And now I think there's free lunches everywhere. But
how can you afford to give out food for free,
yeah,
Google?
It's crazy. It's crazy.
But was Marcus at Twitter pre-IPO?
Yes. Yeah. Way pre.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Wow. So Hack Reactor was like a passion project for him. He was already like,
yeah,
at the time at least, right? Probably started out like, okay, like I want to just help people.
Oh, it was insane. It was crazy. He was doing sort of two jobs for a little while. He would go to Twitter at like 10 a.m. and then he would work there until like 5 or 6, and then he would come back and he would start lecturing at 6. And
wow.
then work with students until 1 a.m. and then we all slept at the office, and then he would get back up at 7, do the lecture of the day, and then go back to work. It was bonkers. But
wow.
Anyway, I slept on. I was like the first prototype, I guess. I slept on his couch and learned to program while sleeping on his couch. And it was just, everything was broken back then. I think you all probably remember this from before boot camps existed. You would try to learn to program and you would just run into walls left and right. And you would have no idea how to solve your problem. So he would give me a problem. He would be like, do this thing in JavaScript. And then he would go to work and he would be gone for like 6 hours. He would come back and I'd be like, okay, Marcus, I think I figured it out. I spent all day working on it. I think I have to change my BIOS. And he'd be like, whoa.
He's like, no.
Yeah, he's like, you just named your variable wrong. And I'd be like,
it's like,
like, I'm going to go with the BIOS thing.
Try that out. Oh, by the way, I deleted your computer, Marcus.
Yeah, it's like my motherboard has a problem. I traced this all the way down to the system level code.
Like, that ends up happening so much. Just like all these, issues where it's like, oh, I'm sorry, your C compiler isn't up to date, and then you're like, oh God, I got to get a new C compiler, and it's just so not programming, right? It's all the stuff that's like way less of your life. You have to do it one time once you get your computer set up, and then you're done. So anyway, it took me like a year and a half to like become a normal programmer. And along the way, I had a job for like $24,000 a year, where I was just working with some group out of Startup Chile.
Startup Chile, yeah, that was like the $40,000 to move to Chile, right?
Yeah. Oh, I want to say it was more than that even, but you have to be based there. And so the people who were running that company were down there, but they needed some developers. And they wanted to build it. I think it was in PHP. It was in PHP, and so I had to work with them on some PHP stuff. So we were like, "This is broken. This takes forever. It's really hard." And I had gone through a program called Dev Bootcamp in the very, very, very beginnings of back when it was just a guy who had posted on Hacker News that was like, "Hey, I'm going to teach my friend how to program in a coffee shop." And I got there and I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like, it feels like a startup. It feels the vibe.
Can I ask you, Tony, like I've always wanted to ask this actually to our first class of students. Like, what made you even want to sign up for that? Because I'm just curious, like, what were you, I mean, it was thousands. I know it was a lot cheaper at the time, but it was still thousands of dollars, right? And like, what gave you the confidence that that this is possible? I'm sure, your software engineering friends were like, dude, like we spent 4 years learning this. What are you going to do in 3 months?
It was a little bit different for me, I think, than a lot of the people that were in that class. I was coming right off of being the CTO of a company at that point.
Okay.
It was just a little startup. I was CTO of a little startup that had just gotten into an incubator, and I had always felt an imposter syndrome. And so I thought, well, if I go to this thing, then it will legitimize me, like at least it'll be someone saying, oh yeah, I ran him through a curriculum and he knew everything. Even if I don't learn a ton from it,
yeah,
it did end up being very educational, but also just like the credentialing, I guess, and being part of the in crowd and being also, it costs nothing. It costs money, but if you get a job at all, you get it back. You don't even have to get a job through them or anything. That first,
really?
Yeah,
first cohort was like they give you a refund if you just get a job.
Yeah, that first cohort,
wow,
it was like a total experiment.
It's just like experiment. Okay,
yeah.
I see. Okay, that makes it a lot less of a risk to join.
I was coming from a software engineering position, so I was like, I know I'm going to get one, so this is free. So it was 2 months. It was 8 weeks. I was like, I'll spend 8 weeks, have some fun, leave my CTO job, take a break, and then go get like a real job. My plan was go work at Twitter.
Too much. That's too much. You're like a CTO. You're in dev bootcamp.
Yeah, good one.
First class. But I can imagine your classmates must have been in like major FOMO / like imposter syndrome. Like here's Tony just like ripping up the curriculum.
There were a couple of us out of I think there were like 21 of us. There were 21 of us in the first class. And there were at least like 2 or 3 of us that had basically been programmers before.
I see.
And for us, we were like, oh, whoops. Like this is the first like at least 4 weeks were just very, very basic stuff that I think probably in your course and in our course now are not even in the pre-course curriculum. Like you have to know this stuff to even apply at this point. But it was still, working with other developers and pair programming and stuff. I hadn't done a lot of that. I'd done a lot of like individual stuff, building games on my own, building software on that startup Chile thing. I was just on my own. So it was the first time programming with other people. And it definitely felt like a startup. It was on Market Street in San Francisco. And like, watch the trolley go by and you'd be like, oh my God, I'm
a startup.
Yeah.
And this is a class with Sharif Bichet, is that right?
He was the teacher?
He was the everything. There was one guy running that whole thing. And it was his vision and his execution, and I don't think that guy slept very much during.
Did you have the feeling at that point that like this is something very new and interesting? And I know, like later I've spoken to Neil Salas Griffin from Starter League, and he was trying to do something similar in Chicago. And he's like, at the time, he had the same concept, like no idea that this is going to be anything. They're just trying to do something useful, right? Like no feeling that they're starting a revolution kind of in education.
I think nowadays, a lot of people feel like it is very obvious where it was going to go. But as with everything, it was not obvious back then. The number of Hacker News posts and Reddit posts and things that were like, this is ridiculous, and you're fleecing all these people and stealing money, and you should go to jail. Just all this stuff. I think he was enduring a significant amount of criticism. But on the other side, there were all sorts of early adopters, right? So there were tons of programmers and just people who were interested in education. There was no venue for them.
There
was no other like whatever, like third party sort of like create your own course or whatever. That stuff didn't really exist back then. And so it was an outlet. for those
Even
people.
Code Academy had just, I think they hadn't graduated from YC yet even, right? They ended up becoming
Right.
like one of the big early starter
Yeah.
places
And
where people
start pretty early as well. I feel like you all probably were starting and watching that stuff develop as you were starting. Was that scary?
We started in 2012, and the way we started was actually interesting. Like, we didn't start as a boot camp. We started as something called MBA Code School, where we were trying to do like a little different take on like code education. And at that time, I don't know about David. I think David had maybe heard about, like, there are a couple of boot camps popping up, but I had not even heard about this concept of boot camps at the time. We just thought we were, I had just gone through business school. And I was like, a lot of people want to learn how to code. And so we were just like, oh, why don't we just go to business schools and teach them how to code? Because they're already there. They don't have jobs and they want to learn how to code, right? And so we just came up with this MBA code school. And it just turned out to be really, really popular, but a huge pain in the ass to run.
It's like so funny. I always think the story is like me and Nimit, because me and Nimit had been working together for a while, and we were sitting in his apartment at Wharton brainstorming ideas. And it's like, if we only could figure out a problem. And then everyone would come into the room and be like, guys, are you two coders? Can you teach us how to code? Can you teach us how to code? We're like, if we could only find customers for something, right? And then people kept asking us and asking. And finally we're like, you know what? Let's just do a class to get these people off our back. I mean, this is the romanticized version, but it's how I remember it, right? We kind of put that class up. And we're like, we'll put this class up, just get these people off our back, like Nimit's friends. And before we knew it, we had filled up a class of 30 people to take a coding class from us at Wharton. And so these are all like types.
That was actually our first class. Like,
did you charge them?
Yeah, so it was a couple $100 a seat. And so we were like,
wait, what did you say, Dave?
A couple $100 a seat.
So so it was actually $300 a seat, Tony, but we gave everyone $100 discount, 33% off for everybody.
Because they were Nimit's friends.
So it was actually only $200 a seat. But this was just like a 2-day seminar. It wasn't like really that it wasn't like but for us at the time, even that was a lot of money, because we were both like, we were just kind of sitting on couches type of thing. Like, I was living with my uncle. It wasn't like But
I think what you said is so interesting, that it was like a bunch of people who felt something in the market and creating something. And then now when you look back, I mean, boot camps are talked about as part of the educational landscape, right? So it's like from a top down thing, it looks obvious and that there was this need that was growing, but it wasn't. That's not necessarily how things start, right? Things start because people find little needs here and there and they start filling them. And it's crazy. Yeah, I don't think in 2012, 2013, we thought that 20, 30,000, 40,000 people per year would be graduating from boot camps and going into into workforce. Like, it's been very durable.
So the other question I have for you guys, Tony, which I think that you guys did phenomenally well at this, and I think you, in a sense, you really you gave us the confidence to do it, because everybody else had set like a market price point and just like a way of doing things, and you guys just tore through that, right? It like from the very beginning, pretty much. And so, what was the history of that thinking? Because was it because you were in SF and you were in kind of a competitive market and you needed something that was just going to be a whole different take on this, or something else? Just curious how that mindset came up.
Yeah, that one I definitely cannot take credit for at all. That was 100% my co-founder, Sean Drost. He had been reading all sorts of startup sort of like Medium posts or whatnot before Medium, sort of Paul Graham's everything, everything. And also, who's that guy who made that bingo chart?
Kazumius.
Kalzumius, right.
Yeah, Patio.
His thinking. And so some of this just says like, hey, set a price point that is high enough that you will lose customers, but that you can
find the diehards
profitable. Yeah, and it gives you a lot more freedom to address that market. Also, no one was really addressing that particular. Everyone was fighting over the sort of like $10,000 level, and so we specifically wanted to be sort of the extreme end of everything. So we were sort of like 6 days a week, 11 hours a day, like just it was like Fight Club. It was just like go away,
Yeah.
like be here, and it's expensive, and there's no guarantees, and all this stuff. And so by doing that, I think that was maybe accidentally a huge part of our success because it acted as a filter, and the only
Yeah.
people who showed up were the people that, I remember when I was at Dev Boot Camp and I was there on like a Sunday night working because that was fun. There was a handful of people, and all those people were very successful, as you might imagine. And so we just kind of built that into the offering. And in order to do that, we also had to charge a lot of money. And also, we wanted it to be very clearly like, this is the one, we're not the one that's at scale, and we're not the one that is asynchronous, and we're not the one where it's work-life balance. We're the one that's like really crazy and expensive.
Yeah. Like you are the most committed. Like you're looking for the people who are the most committed, the most intense. And those people will get the best outcomes, and they'll also love being around each other, right? Like those people will also want to study with each other.
Yeah, which you probably have this in your class as well, because I think any successful boot camp has learned to build this into the culture. A culture of, oh, well, let's noodle on this after class or whatnot. Let's continue to use our brains on this. Let's decouple the hours that we spend on this from progress.
Yeah.
And let's couple progress that we've made in our thinking with progress, and not measure it based on hours, but instead measure it based on our progress. And when people, they tend to just go nuts with the hours. They tend to like stay up until working on stuff. And at least from the full stack people that I have talked to, that culture seems to be alive and well in your classroom.
Yeah.
One thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is choosing JavaScript because in 2012, I think if I think about the schools that were there, Dev Bootcamp, it's funny that people think about coding as a very much technology thing, but to me, it's very much a community thing, right? And Ruby on Rails was really dominating the talk in the startup community, and JavaScript was, I would say, fringe back then, right? Now it's the most mainstream of anything I've ever seen, but it was fringe. It was the only people who were doing JavaScript were front-end people, and almost begrudgingly, right? And Node was around for probably a couple of years, but really kind of sitting in obscurity, I would say, in 2012, 2011.
Like you're just hearing about a couple of big name companies starting to use it for certain applications in their backends.
Yeah.
I've written a bunch of thought pieces on JavaScript, but I've never really kind of dug into like, what was your reason? Why did you choose JavaScript, full stack JavaScript as a curriculum?
There's going to be a trend here. I can't take credit for that. That's me.
No, you don't have to take. I mean, you're representing the organization, so.
Yeah, but I guess that's sort of my role in the org, is to sort of like take all the good ideas and mash
own them. Yeah.
Yeah, but I tend not to have many of them myself. So my brother Marcus was working at Twitter, and he also was a co-founder of Hack Reactor, and he just called that one. I personally was like, maybe we should do something like Python, Ruby, something like that was like common. But he was like, no, the future is JavaScript, and it's not going anywhere. And for all of these reasons, he was a front-end engineer at Twitter. And because Twitter went through this process of learning how to flex your front end and push your app into the client side, as opposed to letting it all live on the server side, and he was a part of that process, I think because he watched that happen, he sort of got a little bit of a crystal ball into seeing where everything was going. So much more powerful and flexible. And a lot of the stuff things we take for granted now, right? Like sort of data binding type stuff, and that stuff didn't exist back then. They were just getting started with stuff like Meteor, remember that? And Firebase.
Yeah.
These things were.
I remember Twitter rewrote their front end with Mustache, and it caused a lot of problems. Like there was a lot of teething pains, right? All the things we have to figure out with single page applications, right? Like how the back button works, how page state is, how navigation and state happens. It's crazy how many things that we just didn't. We knew they kind of be problems, but we didn't know how to solve them back then yet, right? And so Twitter, you're right, it was on the cutting edge of that front end. I'll say Twitter, and then almost a whole different genetic branch was how Google was doing everything, right? They had like Clojure, compiler, all that stuff. It was many different flowers blooming. But yeah, that was a good call, I think.
Yeah, I think the other thing that made a lot of sense to me at the time was sort of almost like a political reason to do JavaScript. Marcus made the point where he was like, if you wanted to update Ruby, or if you wanted to unseat Ruby, you could write a new programming language and people could just start using it. You cannot unseat JavaScript because you have to get all the browsers together to have a conversation to support some new programming language. And that doesn't happen that often. And even if it did, like, they argue a lot with each other. Progress is just going to be slow. And the only thing that the browser recognizes is JavaScript right now. So it's going to take a long time for anything to unseat JavaScript. Now, the downside of that is JavaScript does not iterate very quickly. It stays archaic in the ways that it is archaic for a long, long time. But that also turned out to benefit us because the way that JavaScript was archaic actually made for people being confused a lot about JavaScript, which really lent itself to teaching a boot camp about it.
Yeah. I remember like Clojure and Prototype still are those things that just, it drives even programmers crazy, much less students, right? They use unfamiliar words and kind of strange ideas. We'd love to hear kind of the also the thoughts around the intensity, right? I remember Hack Reactor. Do you guys still do this? It was like the 6 days a week, 11 hours a day. Was that, you guys, one, do you still do that? And two, when you came up with that, was it feels like, a little bit madness, a little bit genius. How did students take it? And more, I'm also curious how you and the staff took it too. Like, it's like intensity. It's like constant intensity for years.
Yeah, it's the last part that's the problem. It's the constant intensity is fine. It's the for years part that's an issue. Originally, we were actually even more intense than we are today. We still do 6 days a week, 11 hours a day, but it is Monday through Saturday, and 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. It used to be Friday through Wednesday, and Thursday was your day off. And the reason we did that was because, number one, banks are open on Thursdays. So because they only have one day off, we wanted to give them a business day where they could get stuff done. And then two, we didn't want them drinking on Saturday night. Goes along with the theme of intensity and singular focus and immersion. That was unsustainable. I think we changed it after like 3 cohorts or something. The students didn't love it. We had not predicted the conflict with religion, which bubbled up for both staff and students, and it became unsustainable for staff.
Yeah.
So we still do 6 days a week, but Sunday is the off day.
And do you give students? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nimit.
I was gonna say that, like, I remember this. It was like an arms race toward intensity at that time, and I think today, for in a lot of ways, that arms race is not there anymore. Where I think that there are now, segments of boot camps and like types of education that people are interested in. And so, but at the time, I remember that we felt like, hey, we're doing like our day ended at 6:30 at the time, and we're like, hey, we think our curriculum is just as strong and this and that. But a lot of our students would be like, hey, but Hack Reactor is like, going till 8. Like, why are you guys ending at 6:30? And I remember there was this pressure to increase intensity, but maybe this is what happens in the early stages of an industry where at first there is this like pressure to be the very, very best, but then as the number of students increase and in the industry scales, then you have to start making your program more accessible to the rest of the community, because and at least that's what we felt. I mean, I know that, right, you guys are still on the intense schedule, but we felt like if you're if you're not going to let people go home in the evening, then it's hard. I don't know how you manage it. I don't know how you manage it for staff as well. But do you, and actually that's the question, I guess, is that did you feel like that model, like how were you able to make it scale? You guys are clearly like massive, one of the biggest players in the bootcamp space.
Yeah, the scaling issue, I agree with you that as you get out of the first adopters and you get into sort of like more mainstream, the average person that is going to hit your website is not, that's not exactly what they're looking for. It turned out to hook into a different thing. I think initially it hooked into people feeling like, oh, yay, the intensity, that's great. And then it turned into more like Tough Mudder, where the difference is the difference between like an actual boot camp where it's like, oh my God, I'm looking for intense and this is intense.
Yeah.
Versus, oh, if I survive this thing, then I win. I actually don't think that's a great way to think about it, and we try to dissuade our students. Some students, I think, come in thinking it's a conveyor belt, and as long as you are standing at the end, then you get a job.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, both that's miserable for them, right? Because they're just taking a beating for 12 weeks. And two, it's not accurate, because if you don't see it as an opportunity, if you don't see every minute as an opportunity, the learning, for whatever reason, goes down, and the efficiency gains that you get for being intense, you lose some of those efficiency gains because you're only doing it for artificial reasons. So that is an issue. The staff issue that you were talking about, we had to solve after a year or two. We noticed that like it just wasn't possible for the founders to stay there until 1 a.m. every day, and on Saturdays and everything. It just didn't work. So we built in sort of a revolving door of people who could be the pace car. So we would sort of select the most intense individual from any class and be like, all right, your job now is to bring that intensity to this next class and mentor them and model correct behavior. And then we didn't have to actually be the model. We just had to tweak how they were behaving so that they would work for the students. That was much more sustainable. Staff, same thing. Like, it just doesn't work to have all of your staff working 6 days a week, 11 hours a day. So we had to kind of rejigger staffing structures and things so that no one individual staff was on the hook for 6 days. But I would say for like a year and a half, maybe 2 years, staff just worked 6 or 7 days a week, 11 hours a day. It was bonkers. Totally unsustainable.
Yeah.
Tony, what are the principles that you were leading Hack Reactor with, or what did you? Maybe this is a separate question, but what do you think makes boot camps work and makes some boot camps have better outcomes for their students than other boot camps, right? And like, what are the things that you were saying, like, because, for example, one thing I always thought is that ours doesn't translate to learning. Our productivity, right? Like in my own life, there's times where I'm taking it, or we all know people who like they seem to go through life very gracefully and get a lot done, and people who are like always churning but never get anything accomplished. Yeah. So I'm curious, like, besides ours, what are the things that you thought this is what makes Hack Reactor work, and this is how we win against competition?
Well, a major thing that I think helped us early on and still helps us is the culture, the ethos of problem solving. And so I think one of the things I admired about the curriculum that I've read about Full Stack models how it's similar to how we thought about it, which is like, don't focus on frameworks or rote memorization or bits of knowledge. Instead, focus on helping people figure it out. And this is uncomfortable for students. And so I get why a lot of boot camps don't do it, because you will get complaints. Very frequently, we get people saying, I paid for a course and you're making me teach myself. And in some ways that is true, but it's not. It's actually harder to get them to teach themselves than it is to just tell them the answer. The problem is when you tell them the answer, eventually you're not going to be there, especially once they get a job, and then there's no one to tell them the answer. So you have to have this like slow gradation from like very low autonomy over here, where you're supplementing them a lot, and like buttressing their knowledge base. By about halfway through the course, our hope is that they need us none, and we are only acting as rocket fuel. And so we would just keep honing that. And anytime that there was a student that asked questions, we would be kind of a pain in the butt about it. We would be like, okay, what did you already try? What did you think? How are you approaching this problem?
Yeah.
Sometimes they would get so frustrated and they would just be like, why don't you just tell me what's wrong? I know you know. And it's like, yes, I know. But if I just tell you what's wrong, how are you going to figure it out next time? Much better for me to tell you what I would do next. And in some cases, it's just modeling out frustration tolerance, right? Like sometimes I would sit with a student and they would be like, oh, this is so frustrating. I'm never going to get it. And I'd be like, all right, look, let me just try a bunch of stuff. And you can just, since they wanted to bail out, I would give them options. I would be like, look, if you ever get so frustrated that you don't want to follow this Socratic method, then just tell me and I'll just solve your problem. But when they did that, and they did that sometimes, I would be like, all right, here we go. I don't know what's wrong, so let's figure it out. Boom, and they'd be like, I did that. And I'd be like, well, yeah, that didn't work. Okay, and this thing. And they'd be like, I did that too. And basically, in the course of like 2 minutes, I did what had taken them like 3 hours. And what it came down to is the difference was that I was not spending half an hour beating myself up about it not yielding to me in between each attempt. I was just like attempt. I was following a problem-solving process of narrowing down the problem and figuring out what it was. Yeah. And so in a lot of ways, that was very validating for students to see someone else go through the exact same failure patterns as them, but just knock them out of the way quickly, faster, and without the sort of emotional baggage that went along with it. And so embodying that was really important. And I think especially that was important because as we expanded to new locations, we noticed when that culture made it on the airplane and when it didn't. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like you could see a campus not doing well, and then you go there, and you're like, why is this not going well? And then you would discover, they're
just giving out answers.
Yeah, giving out answers. The students are sort of just like sitting there, just eating the answers, and getting a little chubby as a result.
Yeah, I've always thought it's interesting that like, because when we create the curriculum, right, and we create all these tasks, but the task is not important. It's the process of solving this task is important, but students get task oriented and instructors should get process oriented, right? It's like, look, executing the game of life has no actual task value, right? It's the process that you go through. So I think that's one thing, like, the more I think about learning itself, the more I think we don't talk enough in education about meta learning, right? How do we think about learning? We're much too like, let's test that they know this specific material, not how they got to it or how they would solve it for themselves. And I think I hear a lot from students and alumni is that really what bootcamps do really well, or what good bootcamps do, is they taught me how to learn. And sometimes it feels like when that happens, it almost feels like you did it yourself. But I think that's the magic, right? Where it's like it's intrinsic to your thought process now.
I have a funny story about that. You all started a school. You started a startup, and so like starting a startup is a massive undertaking, and you're not getting enough sleep, and you're kind of building it like you're building the railroad just a couple of feet in front of the train, and it definitely feels that way. And sometimes you get caught. And we got caught one day, and we even though we stayed up all night, we just hadn't written the curriculum for the next day. And so we knew what the topic was, and it was in the syllabus and all that, but we didn't have a lecture, we didn't have a slideshow, we didn't have anything. And so Marcus got up there and he was like, all right, today we are talking about D3. What is D3? And he Googled D3 in front of the students. And then he was like, oh, Oh, it's a visualization library. Okay.
Oh my goodness.
Well, okay, let's go.
Are you serious?
Yeah. And
That's funny.
This is too much.
loved it because he went from like, what's D3 to having a functional app in an hour. And he was like, oh, so that must be how that works. Okay, well, let's figure that out. And they were like, oh my God, it was just mind blowing to watch him execute his meta learning process on a novel problem, and imagining themselves going back to their computer and going from what's D3 to having an app in an hour. I think before that lecture, all of them would have said that's not a thing. And after that lecture, it's almost like knowing a thing is possible means it's going to happen. It's like when people break a certain record, then all of a sudden everyone's breaking that record, and part of it's just like that's possible, and then everyone's like, okay, if that's possible, then I'll do it. And so I think students benefit in that way. Do you guys have stuff like that where you give them access to build that level of confidence?
I think we, in the early days, we did have instances like that once in a while, but it came from maybe us misjudging the timing. Like sometimes we would write a new curriculum, right? And we wouldn't know that, hey, students are going to finish this way faster than what we estimated. So I remember times where we're like, hey, Dave, like we have like 4 hours left in the day and we're done here, and like maybe David's still, finalizing the next day's curriculum. And so then, it's like we just have to create something interesting. But I think that's what's amazing about programming is that the process of discovery itself, even for experienced programmers, there's just so much stuff out there that ultimately what we're teaching the students is the process of learning, not just like any fixed curriculum, right? And so it was never, I think, a bad experience for students, even if you were learning with them, building a project with them, things like that. And I think that in the early days, that was probably also something that the students liked about the fact, like they knew they weren't getting they knew they weren't at a boot camp that was like, has been here for years, has graduated thousands of students, like everything is like debugged, and it's like it's well done by the point. So in a sense, like that's what they were asking for too. But
yeah, for me, that was early on it still is like a big point of imposter syndrome, where when I'm giving a lecture on a new topic, I still feel to some extent that like when I get stuck, I get embarrassed about getting stuck. And so when things start not working, you start like freaking out, like, oh, that's supposed to happen to me. So of course, when I prep for a lecture, usually I'll go through it 2 or 3 times, make sure everything works. But you still get to sometimes where it's like, oh, I wiped that directory and now npm is having some bug, right? And you're just on the stage like looking like an idiot. So I think you're absolutely right that like as I've done more and more lectures over the years, now I accept that fact, right? That we'll figure this out together. And sometimes that figuring it out is an interesting thing. Sometimes students do get frustrated, like, why isn't this working, right? And then later on you find out that like someone changed a firewall configuration that blocked a port. So we have many of those stories where it was not so much ad-libbing, but we would start navigating through something and get stuck.
Yeah.
But then in that sticking process, still come out with something quite impressive, right? And even different. D3, I've never lectured on D3. I remember one time we did a project where we were trying to teach jQuery, and we ended up just writing our own jQuery engine, and it was like pretty good engine, and that eventually became a project for our students to really understand, walking through the DOM. It's a good recursion lesson.
Hey Tony, I have a like it's something else related to this, but like at what point did you all realize that you need a lot of employees to make this a great experience? Like, I think the reason I'm just working backward from our own realization, because in the beginning, David and I were doing everything. We had our first employee, and she was kind of like jack of all trades, helping us with everything. And at some point, we realized like, hey, if we really want to do a good job with admissions, we need like a separate person focused on admissions. If we want to do a great job with career success, we need like somebody just building employer relations only, right? Like all this stuff, I think. It was so funny because I had finished business school not that long ago. And I think what's ironic is how little you learn in business school, because all the time you're just hanging out and making friends with people. But when you're actually in the fire of it, you can feel it, right? Like, wow, this is actually now a real company. This is not just a project. like there needs to be all this kind of stuff. Did that happen for you guys very quickly, or were you kind of already in that mindset coming from other startup experiences?
Yeah, we were sort of steeped in the San Francisco sort of model of things. So, you scale very quickly, I think, to the point where you need to hire people to do stuff. And
Yeah.
so, again, I think, Sean was tracking on that very quickly. All the way, like our first class, Sean didn't want to teach our first class, basically. He was like, that's not how you build a company. You don't build a company so that it depends on you entirely, and as soon as you walk away,
From the first class, he's like, I'm not teaching.
right. So what he did,
That's
actually,
amazing.
I thought this was so smart. He wrote a script, programmer style. He wrote a script that basically crawled across GitHub and figured out who lived in San Francisco and had been contributing to this, that, and this JavaScript library enough that it looked like they were, pretty senior. And then it sent them an email and was like, hey, we just started a school. Want to come by and teach for like an hour? Just the lowest committal thing possible. And man, we got like 20, 30 people that reached out and was like, yeah, sure, that'd be fun. And that turned into maybe like 10 part-time teachers. So even from the very beginning, there were 10 people from all these companies all over the Bay Area that were showing up usually one day a week, So we'd have between there would be a morning shift and an evening shift. And so between the 6 days, there'd be like 1 or 2 people on shift for any given time. And they would just wander around the classroom answering questions. And so we didn't have to do that, which was a godsend because we were solving all the other problems like real estate. And I mean, that one's really a complex issue, right? Because your class size is volatile. It goes up and down depending on seasonality and all sorts of other things. And so as a result, like we had to move a bunch. And we got really lucky because we moved into a space where we were able to get the floor below us and then the floor below that, like every 6 months as we grew. But I know another boot camp that has moved like 7 times, like once a year basically. They have to move. Yeah, it's brutal.
Yeah, I think real estate management was something very new, and I think in tech startups we're just not used to that as much, right? So quickly, because like real estate here was like core to the business, just having the space. What would you advise, Tony, for like somebody starting a company today, and thinking about? I know that even you guys didn't raise funding, very early on, right? Maybe eventually, but not early on. And so, what would you advise in terms of like that whole decision of make revenue quickly? I feel like in some ways this industry didn't need to raise money that quickly.
I do think that was a mistake on our part. I think we should have raised money because if for no other reason than having someone in your corner to help you make the right decisions, especially about, I mean, we're talking like longer term things, like company related things like selling your company or whatnot. Having someone who has sold companies before in your corner, who is financially incentivized to help you do a good job, is probably much more valuable than the money they give you, actually. And creating the narrative and all that, like we did all that in house, and I think we were neophytes at it, and I don't think we did as good of a job as we could have. For people who are starting new companies, I sit on a bunch of boards and I advise a bunch of companies, and the number one mistake I always see people make is building a whole bunch of junk before you bring it to market. Like people will do like 6 months or a year of like development, or like I literally just got a text today from someone that was like, oh, I have this idea, and I was like, cool, when are you gonna when can I buy it? And they were like, well, how long does it take to make an app? And I was like, wrong question. Sell it before you build it. Like this is an app. Go see whether anyone wants to even give you their email address. And then if someone wants to give you their email address, then maybe book a coffee date with them and be like, would you buy this? How much would you buy it for? Do all this stuff before you build an app, because in their mind they're thinking, I'm going to go build a whole thing, maybe pay some developer team a whole bunch of money to build a mobile app, and then I'm going to launch it and it's just going to click or it's not going to click.
What's the Field of Dreams It's a field of dream startup model, right? Build it and they will come. And I think mostly, I think when I diagnose it, mostly it comes down to fear, right? That you have this beautiful idea in your head and you don't want to test it against reality. And so you rather just keep it beautifully inside. And then, of course, a development shop will be happy to cater to your dreams, right? It's like, oh, $150,000 for a prototype. This is the best idea. So I think that's an enduring reason why I think founders should be, if not programmers, but code fluent, right? Because you can't do it a lot of the stuff.
That's super deep, and I totally agree that deep down, and I don't even think they know it themselves, but deep down they're afraid to get the feedback that actually the market doesn't like their idea.
Yeah.
And the longer they can keep that sort of the more
it's like a defense mechanism to continue to work on it.
Our whole life we're validated by our parents, our spouses, but the market is the most uncaring, rational like actor that we've ever met. It's very cruel, right? In the sense that it's not even cruel. It's just it doesn't give two craps about your dreams,
right?
And so I think it's very scary to interact with it. And I think startups, you know, I always joke with my wife who's in finance, where it's like you go work at a big company like Google. Google has basically tied themselves into like the main sewage pipe of the economy, right? And you can put your straw into Google's pipe. But when you're a entrepreneur, you're like trying to drill into this thing. It's like 50 inches of like pure leaded steel, right? Yeah. It's like, and so, you know, it's hard. I think to all entrepreneurs, you gotta give them credit to even have that goal, but it is scary to hit the reality of what interacting with the market is like. Tony, I'd love to get your thoughts on the industry, you know, the education world, because I think one thing I've always been impressed by is that your background, you have a Fulbright, you were a Fulbright scholar in Korea, right? And so I think probably been thinking about education for a long time. You know, what do you think coding bootcamps go from here? How do you think they integrate into or what do you think coding bootcamps sit in the ecosystem of educational alternatives, and where does it go? Because I feel like we've definitely, you know, proven that coding bootcamps, I mean, they were not a flash in the pan, right? In 2012, everyone was saying, all right, this will be here. The market's hot. Once the market will equalize, things will be fine, right? But even today, I still feel like coding bootcamps aren't supplying enough talent that the industry is asking for. So, yeah, curious, what are your thoughts? Where do coding bootcamps go from here? Or maybe what do you have as your vision for Hack Reactor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I also noticed someone just posted and said the same problem is true about students who think they have to know everything before they go and get a job, and that's just not true. I remember on a job posting once, the student said like, oh, well, you know, I don't think I can apply for this job because it says I have to have 5 years of React experience. And React was like 1 year old at that time. And I was like, okay, look, like this is not how this is decided. But to your question, like how does this fit in the industry? Honestly, I feel like we have a lot of, it's more like the industry has a lot of learning to do from boot camps, I think. I don't know whether you all relate to this, but you probably do, because I heard Nimit say earlier, like you were teaching people how to learn. And I would imagine you all relate to the idea that is portable to other things, other topics.
Yeah, of course.
You had students that go on to build. There's one student that built this like guitar boot camp, and now people are learning guitar much faster. I have tried to learn 3 languages. I tried to learn French in high school and then Spanish in college. Lived in Spain for 6 months, and then I lived in Korea, and eventually I learned Korean. All language education is terrible. It's just terrible. And I've been to like so many different institutions, private ones, universities, high schools. It is all just like not using any of the stuff that we use that makes us really effective, and totally could. And I would say the biggest thing, the like backbone on all that stuff is just holding accountability and applying the scientific method towards education. Imagine it's like a program that is run on human brains. Our education is basically an algorithm that we are running on students. And in normal education, in like high schools and university, there's no feedback loop. They never go back and go, did that work? How should we change it? What should we do differently? Like, how can we make it go faster? Like, did this click? Did it not? Whereas you all do, and we do, we were iterating on our curriculum every 2 days. Like literally every 2 days, we would have an hour-long session with the students where we would say like, what went well, what didn't go well, how can we change, what didn't you like, what could have gone faster, how could we combine this with other stuff, what order should we do stuff in, and they would complain about things and they would like things, and there was value in all of that, and we would iterate constantly. And now we're on something like our 150th version of the curriculum. It is streamlined. It is extremely tight. And basically, if there is any question about like, why do you do this? Why do you do that? There is definitely an answer to every little thing, why we do everything in every order with every little bit. I think you could do that for all other education too. And so where does bootcamp fit in the industry, in the education industry? My guess is eventually other educational things will pick up this model. It's already happening, but I think it will happen more with like nursing and dentistry and guitar and like a whole bunch of other things where we can hone our educational pedagogy and apply what we've learned in this industry to other things and empower people more. It's easier to do here because programming is a meritocracy. So there's no credentialing. Like you don't have to be like, oh, I graduated from here, so I'm qualified.
What do you think about? Because I think so I'm largely in agreement. I think one thing that makes it hard to translate. Boot camps work really well in programming, and I think that's most boot camps have as they look at expansion, you look at certain areas that it also works well in, right? UI, UX design, data science, cybersecurity, right? Things that are technical, and I think one thing we take for granted working with computers is just how fast the iteration and response feedback cycle is, right? Like you make a program and it fails. Like we joke about compile times, but literally you can do this in like 10 seconds. Your computer says you're an idiot, right? Whereas I can imagine in medicine, for example, right? Like, could there be a medicine bootcamp where these things take years and years to find out, right? Like right now we're seeing with COVID, this vaccine, right? Like there's no vaccine creation if we could create a vaccine creation boot camp, we'd be doing it and let 1,000 people create vaccines, right? But like the iteration cycle for all this stuff is going to take years, maybe even decades for us to figure out, did we do the right thing? So that, I guess my question is, what do you think? So I think it's pretty well established that boot camps work in tech. I think the idea of taking boot camps to ESL is, or not ESL, but like language learning is definitely a lot to be done there. Yeah. But what are the things that you think? What do you think would be next? You mentioned nursing. Anything else that you think like this industry or this way of education could be done much better using an intense?
There's a couple of ways to look at that. There's a couple of different equations that you can set up to come up with maybe different answers. Equation one is supply and demand. Part of the reason that the boot camps worked as well as they did is because you could take someone who was making 30 grand and 6 months later they're making 100 grand. And so the
intrinsic motivation of the student is a big ingredient, right?
Yeah, and the ROI, for their tuition is huge. So that would yield a whole bunch of things. You would look for sort of like medium to high paying things where you needed not like a ton of credentialing to get in, and that would build a certain list. Another way to create a list would be sort of what, to your point about iteration cycles, where can you get feedback the fastest? With language learning, I think you actually can get feedback pretty quickly. Definitely on the form of like weeks or days, and by having someone listen to you and be like yes, no, or having a computer like correct your grammar. But I think with a little bit of effort, you could even get it to the point where it could correct your pronunciation and things like that very, very quickly, and that would create a different list of things that were ripe for transformation. And then the last one is just sort of like where are credentials the lowest? Because for example, I guess being a lawyer, you just have to take the bar, right? Like you don't actually have to go to law school, but just like no one doesn't.
Yeah, I think there's some states like it's a mixture, but you're right. Like you could pass the bar in California and be a lawyer without going to law school.
So that might be interesting. But other things, it's not possible. Like you must have a higher degree or a university degree or something in order to qualify. So those are just off the list.
Let me ask you, with Hack Reactor, I always feel like within education leaders, there's like a problem, like there's a problem that you're solving, and there's a problem you're like, wow, I really wish I could solve that problem. Is there, like, usually it's in like K-12 or higher ed or some, like, is there a problem that you're like, we could use this platform, or that haunts you in education?
Yeah, I mean, two things. One of them is language, just because I've tried to learn languages and found it so difficult, and also taught and just felt guilty for the ROI that students were getting on the time that they were spending in the course room looking at a book and whatnot. So that's thing one. Thing two, I'm very passionate that about things that help people pull themselves up along the socioeconomic ladder, not between generations, but like in the same generation. And so one of the things that I think could help people is actually not a specific profession at all. It is literally just life skills. I was never taught in school, maybe you all were, I was not taught in school how to take notes, or how to like get a mentor, or like how to start a company, or how to conceptualize my thoughts, or how to like add infrastructure to anything, or why systems are important, or how to automate things. Like, you don't have to be a programmer to automate things. There are lots of ways to automate things, even just with physical, like flashcards or things like that. There's all these life skills that I didn't know that I had to build the hard way. And if I had known them when I was in high school, I would have just progressed on whatever I decided to do so much faster. And I don't think that's taught anywhere. But I know,
I have a theory about this that it just came to me. Like, I was thinking about this a few, talking to some people, and I feel like you're absolutely right that there are meta skills that make you so much better at everything. Right? Like, if you're a quick learner, you can learn. And I think, and I don't discount like that. Some people are just gifted with some talents versus others, right? But like, even if you ignore that for now, people have these meta skills. But I think, to me, like, I've realized that these meta skills are almost like the cheat codes to life.
yeah.
Right. And so, I was playing a game and I was putting in cheat codes, and I was like, this is kind of how I feel in life. Like, I have like the cheat code, right? And the problem is that people who have the cheat codes are too busy using the cheat code, because we only get one game session to play. That to really, sometimes people do pass it down, right? Like, we see it like and we see traces of it, like self-help books. We see people doing, personal improvement lectures and talking about it, and they're trying to pass the self-help secret. But I think you're right. Like, if we could make that into a more formalized curriculum that was imparted on people, the general productivity of the world would magnify, right? All these like life cheat codes.
Help books are good, but I think that the thing that a boot camp, the next boot camp that we all start together, the thing that boot camp would do is we unify the theories, instead of just like, getting stuff done or whatnot, or like whatever book there is about how to do stuff, that sort of like proposes a theory about one very specific aspect that you then have to incorporate and cross-reference against all the competing theories that disagree with that theory, and you eventually throw up your hands, right? I think this is what a lot of our parents do, is they provide a unified theory for life, and they are sort of like the chassis that you attach all of your learnings onto and are trying to incorporate things into. So the boot camp really would just, I think a lot of people don't understand the value of the boot camp as the curation in a way. Like, it's not like you can go learn that stuff on your own, but you wouldn't have chosen those things to learn. You would have chosen a bunch of dumb. You would have learned about your BIOS and like how to like figure it out. You wouldn't have been like, no, screw all that.
Well, I mean, it's easy to get distracted onto you start traveling on like 3 different roads at once, because you don't know, and nobody's opinionated enough to tell you that just do this one right now. So in some sense, like doing something, that's what we tell people about JavaScript too, actually. It's that, like, of course, there are many other backends used in the world, and other than JavaScript. But if you learn one backend really well, then you can actually learn other backends pretty quickly and pretty easily. I started really believing that and I feel like even during full stack, like we really thought about that quote where it's like, you don't want to like you don't want to teach someone to sail, but make them yearn for the sea, right? Like I forget what the exact quote is, but the reason I really
build ships,
right, is
don't teach.
so you don't teach them to build ships, but like make them yearn for the sea. I think that's really important, even in entrepreneurship. Like in some sense, I feel like, why is it that some people they don't want to go through the trouble of entrepreneurship? Because to be honest, it's not an easy life, right? And I think we can sit here, and we were lucky enough and fortunate enough to be in an industry that turned out to be something meaningful in the world. But we've all done startups in the past where things haven't worked out, and we've had to close them down, right, for whatever reason. So it's not always there. But like, what is it that kept us going? And we use the word hunger usually, but I think yearning is another thing. So in some sense, I feel like even the feeling of like how awesome it will be to be a killer developer is like, you got to be like chasing that feeling, because then you're willing to do everything before that to get there, and then you're listening for advice. You're like just slurping it in like crazy. And so Tony, actually, so speaking of like trying to be a developer, right? Like I'm curious, what kind of advice are you giving to students at Hack Reactor, or even just people you're mentoring or thinking otherwise in this current environment? I think what's a question we get a lot from people is that, hey, this is obviously very different, and this is the first time in the bootcamp industry that we are going to be facing kind of like there's not a wind at our back in a sense with in terms of jobs growth, etc. And so like, what kind of advice are you seeing, and do you have any predictions for like where we're going to go with just outcomes, and like how long this period will last, what will happen?
Well, I mean, oh man, I do have a biology degree, but I wouldn't want to speculate on anything medical just because I am so underinformed. But it seems like we're going to be here a while, huh? Like it seems like a vaccine is far off, and states are probably going to stay shut down for a while. And even when they do come back, they're probably going to come back in a limited way. And even when they come back fully, I think people are going to be a little nervous. So I noticed that some companies are going fully remote, like permanently fully remote. I think for students and therefore schools that are entering and adapting to the future, they're going to benefit. Same thing with boot camps, right? Like groups that were teaching people JavaScript back in 2012 flourished, and I think groups that are teaching people how to be thought workers, knowledge workers, who are able to be remote and able to function well and be autonomous, right, and accountable. I don't know about you, but that's my main problem with working from home, is the distraction of the refrigerator, right? And so building in, again, those life skills of just like, how do you collaborate with people? What is appropriate? What is not appropriate? How do you maintain accountability and autonomy while you're working remotely? I think the schools that incorporate those kinds of meta learnings are going to do well, and their students are going to get jobs. I don't think anything's going away as far as like hiring. There might be a temporary lull, but I mean, so, in this period, honestly, companies that are doing well are the tech companies. Like Amazon is up something like 20% or something like that, and is probably hiring a lot right now to handle the load. Zoom, you can tell that it's slow. Like something's broken. They need some programmers. Like a lot of stuff is going to be going digital and virtual, and I think as that happens, the need for programmers and problem solvers in the tech space is going to either stay the same or maybe even go up. I think in the near term, it's gonna be a little rough in the near term, but in the long term, I think it's gonna move forward a trend that was already happening anyway, which is like everyone working from home, being able to get jobs everywhere, Like people are moving to like Portland and Austin and Denver because they don't have to live in San Francisco anymore. They don't have to live in New York anymore. You can get a job anywhere.
Yeah.
The technologies are so good. And so that's why I think you all, are ahead of the game on that front as well, preparing people for that.
And you think that because like development is it's like the perfect job for this environment in a sense, because you can access every single company in the world who is hiring remote employees if you have that role. It's very different than, even, so many different jobs, right? So in a sense, it's like a good job. So there may be a slowdown in the near short term based on how long, we don't know the health. We don't want to, it's hard to guess what's going to happen there, but in the long term, the trends are strong.
Yeah.
Tony, I'd love to end with a question. Just like, what are some of your favorite memories of building Hack Reactor, of what students have accomplished? What are things that resonate with you over the year? I mean, it's been now almost a decade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we also haven't talked about your current life. I see your garden in the back, so maybe we can talk about that next. Also after this, go ahead.
Yeah, and I also have a meeting I have to run to shortly.
Okay. Oh, you mean you don't have all day to talk to us?
Yeah, these days we are owned by a public company, and there are all kinds of meetings.
Tell me about it.
So, we all remember our first class, right? And just like I remember every single one of those individuals. And my most cherished moment, we love taking people who are doing fine and making them do even better. But I'll bet you your most cherished moment, and certainly my most cherished moment, is that one guy that we really kind of thought might not get a job. And when that person got a job, the whole class went bananas. So happy. He put in so much work against all odds, and everyone thought like, ooh, this is going to be tough. And he applied for something like 300 jobs or something. He was a glutton for punishment. And this is before you could push a button and apply for 50 jobs. He was applying for 300 jobs, just like straight up applications. And he finally got a job. And that was like the encapsulation of why you do what you do and why we did what we were doing.
Yeah, no, agreed. It's the, you run companies, but it's great to see the impact of it on individual lives and how you're right, it lifts people up, and you get to see that in one generation, right? This is not like a multi-generational thing. This is like your life can change right here. That's pretty. I always tell students that I always feel so honored that we get to be on that journey with them. It's a great place to be.
Yeah.
All right, Tony. I think really appreciate your time. It was great. It's always great chatting with you. I think we're like the we're lucky to be pioneers in this amazing industry, and it's been great to know. It's been great to work with all of you guys over the years. So thanks so much for joining us on this, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks so much. Admire what you guys do.
All right, same here.
Thanks.
See ya.
Bye.
See ya.